Our next speaker is Dr. Dale Bartos. We're kind of putting Dale on the spot here. Dr. Ron Ryle is unavailable for a few days, dealing with health issues. And so Dale is doing 2 days in a row, doing double time, and we appreciate it. Dale's a research ecologist with the Forest and Woodland Ecosystem Program for the Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station here in Logan. He's also an adjunct associate professor in the Department of Wildland Resources here at Utah State. He holds a BS and an MS degrees from Fort Hays College in Kansas and a PhD degree in range science from Colorado State University. His principal research interests are in ecological processes in general and restoration of aspen landscapes. He's been working with Aspen for the past 35 years for the Forest Service research at the Logan Lab. He's one of the few scientists left in the western U.S. who is working on this critical species. Please welcome Dr. Dale Bartos.
I do appreciate the opportunity to talk to you again, and hopefully I can do justice to this topic. Like Darren said, this was supposed to have been given by Ron Ryle, and as he indicated, he does have some medical issues that he's taking care of right now, and we wish him the best in these efforts. And I'm sure he would much rather be here than doing what he's doing. Ron and I have talked considerably about this topic over the past few years, and I need to say right up front, Ron has a much better handle on this than I do, and hopefully I have captured what he would be speaking about. He's much more eloquent at describing these things than I am, but anyway, hopefully I can do justice to it. So the basic premise is that we need really a more functional classification for aspen as we're dealing with it on a landscape basis. And that's pretty much what I'm going to be talking about today. We all know that Mugler has done a tremendous job in developing community-type classifications for aspen, and these are used considerably throughout the Intermountain West and the western U.S. But we sort of feel that there might be a better way a more functional way of doing this classification and giving it to the land managers. The first thing I want to do is refer to this publication, and incidentally, I did bring another box of them over. There should be plenty out in the hallway for you to get a copy. In this publication that Wayne Shepard, Paul Rogers, Dave Burton, and I did for the Sierra Nevadas, we came up with 7 specific classifications for aspen. And Ron and I feel that this might be a starting point on this discussion, and that's where I'm going to start. We might come up with these particular 7. We might add to them, we might delete, or we might not use it at all. But anyway, this is a starting point. And in this publication, we have defined 7 specific classes of aspen. Here we have the meadow fringe area, which is a Seral aspen community, and you note that there isn't any aspen coming out into the meadows. Now, I'll refer to this a little bit later. It might be good just to mention it now. We talk about a management technique of ripping to increase aspen into adjoining areas, and these meadow fringe areas are ideal for doing that ripping. Then we have the riparian aspen, and of course these are Seral also in most cases. you get out on the periphery of where aspen exists, Northern California, Nevada, Arizona, a lot of the aspen has receded down and exists in the riparian zones primarily. Then we have the upland aspen conifer, and this is Seral aspen community, and how many times have we seen this picture yesterday, and we'll see it some more today, or not this particular one, but many like it. Then we have the boulder, lava rock, rocky outcrops that we have that aspen exist on. It seems like they exist in those areas considerably, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. Some stable aspen communities, we have the snowbank areas that we talk about. In most cases, very stable and exist where snow accumulates. This is a particular one that I'll talk about a little bit later that we might need to address and look at expanding or modifying. Then, of course, we have the upland pure aspen, the stable aspen community types that we see here. Now, to me, most of my efforts, what I have talked about in the past, or currently, is the stable aspen, these upland aspen types, and the successional aspen conifer systems. But there are other systems out there that we need to be aware of and take into consideration for management and other activities. And then the seventh category is the crumholts. And these are generally stable aspen communities that exist at high elevations, that primarily on windswept ridges and areas where they do have a little bit of protection, but we get 10-foot tall aspen that's 50 to 75 years old, and not your typical run-of-the-mill aspen that we think about. So, what are some of the differences among these various aspen classes? Of course, their stand structure, that's very obvious. The crumholts that I was talking about maybe gets 10 feet tall, as opposed to the upland pure aspen that you could find 75, 80 feet tall. The structure of the stands are very significantly different, and of course the stand dynamics definitely, the crumholts or the snowbank aspen is functioning much differently than the standard types that we look at, the aspen conifer and the pure aspen. And of course, there's a tremendous difference in the associated vegetation with these various types. We talk about aspen being very productive in the understory, and when we talk about that, it's generally the pure aspen, the aspen conifer systems. Some of these areas, like the crumholts or the rocky outcrops, not very interesting understory in these cases. And then, of course, we have the situation, some stands or classes are very easily invaded by other species, such as the conifers, like we see and are dealing with in many instances. And then, of course, various classes have different growth potentials as related to the environmental conditions. And, we have some classes of aspen. I'm thinking of the pure and the conifer invaded aspen, that we treat these areas and we can get 2, 3, 6 foot of growth a year on some of these, and you get on the crumb holes in the snowbank, you might get an inch of growth per year if you're lucky. So there's dramatic difference in the growth potential from these various classes. And then, of course, genetics is a very, probably a very key component here that comes into play. And genetics probably plays a big part in how these, the potential for growth and the structure and the dynamics also. Why do we have these different classes? Well, for one, let's look at the physical environment. Air temperature comes into play. For instance, in the crumb holes, they are at high elevations, very cold climate, and so temperature would be a component there in those situations. And even like in the snowbank areas, you would have some protection there, and would be contributing to differences in the various classes. Of course, you're going to have soil types that are different with these various classes. And within that, you're going to have a tremendous difference in the water dynamics and nutrient cycling. And we heard about the nutrients in the aspen soils related to succession yesterday from Mike Amaker, and there's a tremendous importance there. He has put those values in as a critical component to the aspen system. And so another aspect is the ecohydrology, the water movement by plants and soil processes. And this, I think, is probably where it would be much more interesting to have Ron discussing these, but I'll try to do my best on explaining this as nearly as best as I can. Just a couple examples. The snowpack, or the crumb-holes aspen, like I said, exist at high elevations, and these are generally fed from snowpack that accumulates during the winter and slowly melts during the summer and feeds these areas so that supplies the water for these. What kind of impact is climate change going to have on these areas? If we have a change in the snowpack, a decrease, some of these areas definitely might change dramatically and in a negative way. And like we heard yesterday, there might be an increase in some areas, and so there might be a positive impact on these crumb-holes aspen as a result of that, if we do get increases in snowpack associated with these areas that are fed by that melting snow. Another example, and this is probably not the best example to be showing, is a Snowpocket aspen. What I want to get at here is that a lot of the aspen that we see in the West on these edge of where the aspen exists are these pockets of aspen that exist in sagebrush or other vegetation type, but they're very isolated areas. And how do these maintain themselves on these dry sites? And most of the time, these have developed around seep areas or seep areas where the water is coming down from above, feeding this throughout the summer and allowing the aspen to remain on site. if that phenomenon changes as a result of climate change or something else, and you don't get the water flowing, these areas could very easily disappear. And like I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute with respect to wildlife, but these are very critical areas in these dry expanses of landscape. I'll go back. I think if we're going to add to the classification system as we've laid it out here, the snowpack aspen, there might be a need to revise that a little bit and not just, to include what I just talked about, the seep areas, the aspen that exist in small isolated patches, not particularly just in snowbank areas. How does this all link to management? Now, got several points here I'd like to go through. And it's quite obvious, we say this all the time, all aspen are not the same. And even, clones side by side react differently from one another. And so, however, grouping these in these larger classification systems would maybe make it a little bit easier to deal with this phenomenon on the landscape, particularly doing large treatment areas. And we could develop our management per aspen class. And of course, we need to know how these classes function. The Krumholz aspen is going to function much differently than the upland aspen for sure, in growth and response to treatment and so forth. And our management will need to will be different depending on the resources that we're looking at. I don't think we're going to be going in and harvesting Krumholz aspen. I don't know, we might be getting walking sticks or something out of those timbers that we would remove from those areas. But harvesting is a very viable option for the aspen conifers class or the upland classification also. We wouldn't be going in the rocky outcrops and harvesting. And we wouldn't be grazing in there also. Again, it goes back to the more favorable upland aspen, stable aspen, successional aspen that is producing most of the forage that is being used by the ungulates. And then, of course, wildlife habitat is a critical one that goes across most of those areas. And this is where, going back to talking about those seep area aspen, you go here in northern Utah, southern Idaho, out in Duck Valley, or Park Valley, I'm sorry. And you have patches of aspen in the sagebrush, and you have these patches a mile apart, very isolated little islands of refuge for wildlife and a lot of other things. But those in themselves are very critical component of the wildlife. They hold up in there, they forage in there, and unfortunately, when you're managing and treating those areas, they are congregating in there and utilizing the regeneration, so that they do have tremendous problems in dealing with those kind of situations. But like I said, that is a very good example of very, very critical wildlife habitat, just that one particular class. And effective management for different resources will definitely differ among the various aspen classes. That's sort of a given. So some of these management practices will alter the community composition and function to a degree, and what kind of effect would our various management practices have on nutrient cycling? And Mike again alluded to this yesterday, how fire does play a very, very critical part in resetting conifer invaded aspen back to pure aspen. And if this doesn't happen, and if we get a succession going far enough into the future, it could be very almost impossible to get these back to aspen. And so this is one area that we need to consider. And of course, there's a tremendous amount of difference in the understory composition in these various stands. And how does this change with respect to the management? We were talking last night that there's an area down on the north end of the Dixie that was treated like, when we were out there, it had been treated 17 years before, and it was just a dog-haired stand of aspen. You couldn't walk through it. And the permittees in that area were quite concerned that, sure, we got the aspen restored, but there isn't any undergrowth there for utilization. And we have to make these things perfectly clear to people that are involved with these, either using or understanding these situations, that we might treat an area to get increased wildlife and livestock forage, but that might not happen in the first year or two. And in fact, I can assure you it won't occur that quickly. And so these things need to be definitely spelled out to the users. Of course, there's a considerable amount of genetic diversity and the reproductive type between these various classes. And sexual versus asexual, most cases, like I said yesterday, what we deal with is the vegetative regeneration of aspen. However, in the past 35 years since I've been here in Logan, we have changed our mind considerably about the seeding events that happen. And one example that comes to mind is the rocky outcrops, the lava flows. I think these are ideal situations where we see seedlings coming in, and it's just, you look at the situation, you get these very barren minerals areas that a little bit of dust comes in and settles, and then you have pockets of water that accumulates, and it's just sort of an ideal situation. So I think if we were checking the genetic makeup of these suckers or regeneration in these areas, definitely would be a very diverse genetic makeup in those areas. On the other hand, going to the crumb holes, very unlikely that you would be getting any sexual regeneration there because of the elevation and the temperature, and the conditions just aren't favorable. So this does play, it is a factor that needs to be taken into consideration when considering treatment of these various classes. I wish I were a better ecophysiologist, and this is, I really hope I can explain this adequately to you, but and I'll give a shot. But we see aspen. This is a very healthy, vigorous aspen that has a stand that hasn't had impacts from grazing for the past 100 years and very little wildlife use. Very typical of probably what we saw aspen tall forest communities looking like in the past. Now, you have mature trees out there, and you have the undergrowth, the forbs, the grasses, and even the regeneration. And these are sort of growing in harmony over time. So you have the mature trees here, and you have a component of the understory here. Now, if we go in there like we have done over the past 50 to 100, 150 years and modify that undergrowth and the regeneration even, that is going to take that component, most of it out of the system, which is going to free up more resources for the trees, like water and nutrients. And so you get the undergrowth down, you're going to get more growth in the aspen, mature trees. And they go along and they grow out of their sustainability level of growth. And so you get this extra growth. Then you have a drought come along like we're seeing now in southern Utah, and these trees have grown themselves out of the level that they can function in, and so they are not as able to withstand the drought because of that. And I hope I've made that fairly clear. I guess I can explain that a little bit better maybe in the question session, but to me it really makes sense that from an ecophysiological standpoint, that there is maybe something going on there that we don't fully appreciate that is having a tremendous impact on the system that we had never thought about in the past. And I think Ron and his classes over the last years have discussed this tremendously, quite a bit, and to me it makes a lot of sense. Hopefully it makes sense to some of you too. Now, another example of what might be going on out there. Unfortunately, this isn't the best picture that to show what I want to show. I'll just point out this part isn't what I want to show you. I want to show this over here, but I do want to just point out to you here that this is a wildlife exclosure in central Utah, and believe it or not, there are people that say that fence is what's causing that aspen to grow in here and not out here. That woven wire fence has a tremendous impact on the climate, and so you get the growth inside and not outside. We need to look at our wildlife and our livestock situations here. Anyway, what I want to show here is that under pretty much pure aspen, and that has been pretty well, the vegetation has pretty well been consumed in the understory. Do you think that a conifer seedling would have a better chance of coming in here and getting established as opposed to here? The seed might not even get to the ground here. If you have a healthy, functioning aspen system, maybe those are much better at keeping conifer from coming into the system and maintaining the stable aspen on the landscape. It's just something that has been thrown out. That Ron has had a student working on this for several years, and if he were here, he could share some of that information with you. But the idea is that by some of our management practices, we might be exacerbating or hastening the conversion of aspen to conifer. And again, this makes quite a bit of sense to me. So the idea is that what we're putting forth here is that we probably do need a more functional classification of aspens as we're dealing with management of aspen on a landscape scale. What we put forth are the ones that were used in the Sierra Nevada book. These 7 classes, they could be added to, they could be deleted, they could be completely changed, but there could be caveats attached to these also. Anyway, these are some ideas that Ron and I would like to share with you and give you something to think about. And if we don't get feedback right now, if you don't want to give us feedback at this point, feel free in the future to send me an email or Ron and give us your feelings on this as it relates to management on the landscape level. So, wow. I didn't think I was going to talk more than 50 minutes. I'm sorry about that. Anyway, are there any questions on what I've thrown out here? Or comments? Feel free to give me some of your feelings on what was thrown out here. Are we totally off base? Is there a need for such more functional classification? Can we go back and just use what has been defined, like the community type system that Mugler has put forward? But there, it's much more fine-tuned. You have the aspen tall form, the aspen short form, the aspen shrub, so forth. How do you manage that on a landscape scale? You might just want to look at aspen, stable aspen, or aspen conifer system. So anyway, that just something to think about. And if you have any questions, I'll try to answer. If not, I'll get an answer for you. Yeah, Jess.
As you alluded to, crumble aspen may become more important with changing climate. And from the photographs, it looks like crumble aspen is lower in elevation typically than conifer crumble. One, is that correct? Is that an accurate observation? And two, what sort of elevations and compared to conifer crumbles does aspen crumbles typically occur?
I think it's probably right. It's a little bit lower than conifer. The one area that sticks in my mind is on the Modoc, and that is at 5,000 feet elevation. You have crumbles, and it is on the top of the ridge, just big expanses of all this aspen that's less than 10 feet tall, but it has quite an age to it. Unfortunately, there isn't any conifer crumbles in that area. It's pretty much pure aspen. But yeah, there is a difference there. Yeah, Bob.
To follow up on that, on the beaver mountains, especially mountains, we have a situation where we have aspen crumbles where it could be stable above and it's above 11,000.
The distribution of aspens all the way from shrubs to
Sure. When we talk about climate change effects on aspen, we always say that aspen has the widest amplitude of conditions that it exists in, from across North America, and so it might have some resiliency there in the total picture. You're going to have situations where if you have these seeps, like I was talking about, drying up, you're going to be losing those areas out of those off those landscapes, and
And to follow up on that, this sea flood amplitude across the continent, in local areas, we'll see the sea flood amplitude expressed all over the continent. And very close to this setting, people that described, we have Aspen going down below the canyon on with the juniper, and clear up above the subalpine trees.
So if we're looking at just maybe a temperature change, or I can see the lower end of the aspen drying out. We see it moving, maybe receding back up the hill a little bit, or it might be going a little bit higher if there's more precip, or it might be going lower if there's less. So you see that movement up and down the hill, and that's my view, and I think Bob's view of how aspen will function under some climate change. It's not total, but yeah.
I guess the question is, with this huge range of aspen and all these different functioning types, wouldn't there very likely be some pretty diverse genetic codes to this too?
Yes, yeah. It's interesting, when I first started getting back into the technology transfer, we had a meeting in La Grande, Oregon, and they were treating aspen, and it was very ratty looking, in my opinion. And numerous people thought if you went out there and treated that you were going to get 60, 80 foot tall aspen coming back. But that genetic material is programmed for ratty aspen. You treat ratty aspen, you're going to get ratty aspen. You treat good aspen, you're going to get better aspen. Good aspen, maybe a little bit better. But yeah, genetics is very widespread. And I think we're going to see a tremendous amount of genetic diversity in some of these areas, particularly like the lava flows that I was talking about. I personally feel that those are a haven for seedling events occurring. Yeah.
You mentioned that there's some types of management that we're doing that may exacerbate the elimination of an aspen. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what type of management you were doing?
I would if I can.
It was right at the end of your presentation. You said
that tall form stuff. I think you were saying maybe like grazing or something to eliminate the form so that you get more compost out of it.
Oh, yeah. You have that healthy aspen with that very lush understory, and those are functioning properly. I don't know if we want to get into that or not, but they are much easier to maintain themselves on the landscape through time. But then when we come in, and if we're grazing that off or utilizing that with wildlife or livestock or whatever, reducing that down, then it's going to have a tremendous impact on that system and on that landscape, and probably has profound impacts on the functioning of that system into the future. I don't think I'll talk to you a little bit more about that later on, if you like. Yeah.
That's my one concern. I think these classifications are good, but we're lucky in Idaho to have numerous classifications, and there's a lot of information in the non-aspen component that can actually help in management decision making. That these classes see that as just being a multi-step question in that you're looking at classes versus community types, and community types might be the next step down on your
I think there might have to be a combining of these efforts. You know, like we talked last night, we're still not addressing the fact of that tall shrub component that you have in southern Idaho. You know, that still is not addressed, and that needs to be. Where does it fit in here? We do, you know, we might have this stable aspen, but then we have these categories under there, and to get to these, to answer these questions. Yeah. So, yeah.
I found this very helpful, and I wonder whether you have a checklist or a flow chart or something like that, so that any one of us in this room could go out to an aspen stand, go through a flow chart or a checklist, and arrive at the same classification for your aspen.
Not per se, no. There are. Bob, would you like to talk about?
Can you stand up, Bob? It's hard to do.
Maybe I could say a couple of things that link to this comment and the previous comment. And I think the comment that I would suggest you might consider making use of Mugler's classification. And Mugler's classification has a key, so although it's not a checklist or a flow chart, it does go through, and you can step your way through that key. And different individuals should be at the same community type. With Mugler's community types, there may be a logical way to group several of those into sets, as you could say, the 7 sets or something, and that's areas, and I think that's kind of what you were getting at too, that maybe they can group those together and have it be a subset of this larger management set that you might want to work with. And that would work well for the stable, the Seral, maybe the meadow edge. When you start talking about the Snowpocket, the Crumbolts, the Talus, those are types of communities the Mugler classification really didn't look at.
Right.
They come out as other types of communities. And that may be where the refinement needs to be discussed when we talk about it.
Yeah.
Does that bring both of your thoughts there? With that?
Yeah. Bob had made the comment last night. He was talking about pygmy aspen, is a term that Mugler used, I guess. Referring to the Crumholtz type, and I find that.
Or the Snowpocket, right? But it's the shorter types.
Right.
That are on the edges.
Yep. So, a term I think we might want to try to incorporate in our system. But we anticipate in the near future of convening numerous people interested in this particular topic to discuss this further and develop this into a more usable form. So, all right, Darren?
That's right. One last comment?
I'll make one last comment. A thought that I had in the response to your question about management and what management was referring to. That photo there comes from the Mugler RNA down east of Salt Lake. And in that RNA, although the tall fork community is well expressed and the trees are older, there's obvious evidence of historical fire in that area. And so there's the changes that we made with the management of fire, and there's also, Charles K. uses an expression that pulls this all together. He says we have many situations where we have too many mouths and not enough fire. And that describes the dilemma that we have in a lot of our aspen areas. The too many mouths refer to our management not only of domestic but of wildlife. And not enough fire, not necessarily just because of the too many mouths, but also the way that we've dealt with fire in the last century. Those are the kinds of management things that have really altered the way the Snowpocket Aspen understories and the Aspen overstory itself is expressed on the landscape. Does that help with that? So it's wildlife, livestock, and fire all tied in there. One phrase, too many miles around that fire.
Let's get Dale a hand.
Okay.